the meaning and content because we'll return to it in a little while and talk about what land acknowledgements mean, what their purpose is, and how we can teach using the land acknowledgement in the classroom. So if you're in Brooklyn, you, like me in Brooklyn College, are on the traditional and unceded territory stolen from the Canarsie and Navajo groups of the Lenape people. And that ongoing theft, along with the stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans, enables our presence. If you're in Eugene, Oregon, like our two outside facilitators, you are similarly on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kalapuya people. I hope you will join me in paying our respects to elders, past, present, and future, who have stewarded this land, and in recognizing the hundreds of indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. I know that this acknowledgement is neither sufficient nor complete, but is part of a process of learning and action towards a thoughtful, respectful, and deeper incorporation of indigenous and Native American cultures, philosophies, epistemologies, and peoples into the curriculum, faculty, student body, and staff of Brooklyn College, in line with the City of New York's original mission to provide a transformative, distinctive education to the whole people of New York City, as well as a similar mission of the University of Oregon to provide that sort of education to people in Oregon and especially in and around Eugene. Moving on, we wanted to discuss a couple participation guidelines for our session today. As we discuss, please ask questions in the chat by typing them in, but using the term question. So for example, I will model good practice. Question, Dan, how do we ask questions? I'll be watching the chat so that the facilitators can spend their time facilitating, and we'll pause every so often to address questions and comments that have been building up. We'd also like to take a moment to recognize that this work and the things we're talking about is often charged. Mistakes happen. Terminology often changes. Some of us may be more or less familiar with the state of the art in terminology and ways of thinking. And so we ask that we all, facilitators, participants, me, everyone, is charitable to one another, that we listen to learn. If there's something that doesn't quite sound right, we ask clarifying questions. And also, if you have any ideas for successful communication from your classes, please add that to the chat. We feel very lucky to have so many people in various stages of careers as instructors in classrooms and in the communities in which we live. And we'd like to build off that. So if anyone has any ideas that you've used effectively, please add that to the chat so that we can keep this as sensitive and productive an enterprise as possible. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we'll be recording this today for posterity and to share with those who may not have been able to make it. But if there's anything said that perhaps you would not want shared more widely, just let us know and we can edit it later. We're happy to share this, but we also know that sometimes we can misspeak. And in the age of online communication, we certainly wouldn't want to encourage danger in that way. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, everyone. So I try to be inviting, and I'd also like to really invite you to get to know our facilitators a little bit better. I've known each of these people for a long time. Jason Schreiner taught me my first class about teaching about environmental justice and difference when I was a first-year grad student at the University of Oregon. Kaylee Hudson was in probably my favorite class to teach as an undergraduate, and I'm so excited to be able to introduce them to all of you today. Kaylee is a graduate student pursuing a dual degree in law and public policy at the University of Oregon, who just completed her first semester of law school finals which for those of us who have been to law school is an incredible accomplishment. First term law school finals are the worst, and she's come out of it and never has to do it again. So congratulations to Kaylee. She recently interned with the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., and is very integrated into conversations, both in academic and policy circles, about the issues that we'll be talking about today. A registered member of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde on the Oregon coast, her interests include tribal sovereignty and self-governance. Jason Schreiner is the Associate Director of the Teaching Engagement Program at the University of Oregon, where he's charged with instructor training across a variety of fields, including into talking about difficult classroom topics, critical theories, and so on and so forth. In addition to his work teaching teachers, Jason has also designed and developed a variety of courses for undergraduate and graduate students that foreground critical and anti-racist approaches. I hope you join me in welcoming Kaylee and Jason, and I now turn the session over to them, as well as over to each of you. So thank you all, and I hope you really enjoy what we're talking about today, and I hope we all learned something, myself included. All right, so Jason and Kaylee, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, and everybody, for the opportunity to be with you. My favorite thing in doing this work is learning. And so to have 44 other people here with me to learn today, I think is fantastic. And I always like to say to faculty, I love being an excuse to bring you all together so you can share your own insights, wisdoms, and experience in doing this work. So thank you for that opportunity as well. Maybe I'll just say very quickly how I come to this work, and then I'm going to let my colleague Kaylee do the same. But I just want to note that I come to the work of teaching settler colonialism and decolonization with a little over 20 years of engaging in these issues. First, more as an activist when I was an undergraduate student. I read a book called A Little Matter of Genocide by Ward Churchill, and that fired me up. And so I got involved because it wasn't taught enough at my university. Thankfully, there was a university in my town, Haskell Indian Nations University, that had a lot happening. So I plugged in there. Then when I had the opportunity to come to graduate school and then work at the University of Oregon, I've been teaching and engaging Native perspectives and Native issues in all of the classes that I teach. It's important to me. And so I'm really thankful to have this opportunity to work with you to continue and promote that work. Kaylee?
Thank you, Jason. Good morning, guys. Some of you I got to see on a meeting a while ago, so it's really, really good to see your faces. My name's Kaylee Hudson. I'm a Kalapuya native with the Grand Ronde tribe here in Oregon. So I am still a student. Most of you are faculty. I am still learning. But I have a lot of lived experience of what it's like to be a Native female in life, in academia. There's a lot of good movements happening. I think there always needs to be Native people in Native spaces. So I'm really, really honored to be here and talk with you all. I'm not an expert. I only have my own knowledge and my own experience, somewhat backed by my family and our understanding. So, I'm also here to learn. I've heard great things through our discussion, Dan, Jason, Maddie. I'm still evolving and grappling with some of these things that are really tense. I get fiery about it. I get emotional in my discussions. So I don't think there's a whole lot. Just I really appreciate land stewardship. I think there's so much knowledge and wisdom in Native perspective. But I have a full understanding that Western ideals and some of those perspectives can be just as enlightening. So I hope for a really fun discussion today. Thank you.
I thought that I might start us off by just kind of foregrounding what the kind of underlying fundamental goal of today's session is, and then the associated kind of objectives or goals. And so if you all don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen for a moment to project that up. We didn't come with a big PowerPoint slideshow or anything like that, but sometimes it's helpful just to see concretely articulated what it is that brings us here together. So from our perspective as facilitators, I think I will just put this up and say, you know, what is our purpose today? If I can get my slide to work here. Oops. You know, I think the fundamental purpose is to promote and enact decolonization and healing. Like that's what this is about. We can't solve all that in a couple of hours or a couple of days, but each thing we do each day can contribute to that. So that's kind of the binding force that brings us into this session to work with you today. And more specifically, it's to help folks, Brooklyn College folks, University of Oregon folks, folks everywhere, to adopt teaching strategies that engage these issues in the classroom working with our students. And then I think second to that is, in order to do that well as an instructor, in my experience doing this work on my campus, is to really put together a teaching culture that supports you in that work as instructors and supports student learning around the issues. So that's a key goal today. And then third is to begin thinking about institutional change towards decolonizing the university and beyond, and the larger context in which it's a part. So this is kind of what we're here today as a purpose, and we're really looking forward to engaging you around these goals. So I'm going to stop my screen share because we don't need that anymore. But I just want to highlight, you know, this idea that when we get down into the weeds and the details and the specificities, is just to hold aloft that this is about decolonization and about promoting healing for people with a very, very, very long history of violence that separates and divides and destroys. And so we really want to just make that very explicit, that at the foreground and always in the background is this kind of fundamental goal. In terms of our time today, we thought that it might be useful to return to the land acknowledgement that Dan shared. And he had asked you to kind of think about it. And I just wanted to put a prompt out to all of you, which is, you know, as you heard that land acknowledgement, what stood out for you, or what was maybe different about it than other land acknowledgements you may have heard in other settings? And if you could think about that and perhaps even put some of those thoughts in the chat, and then we can talk a little bit more about land acknowledgements and their use.
And while we type, I just think I should recognize Rosamund King for that land acknowledgement. She shared it with me.
Yeah, I'll second that. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to begin to call up a few of the things that are coming out. You know, some folks noting that it's more in depth than other acknowledgements that you may have heard, including some important details that go with that. And then noting that not just one kind of simple tribe, but there's more And in many cases, there are multiple tribes that can be called up in a land acknowledgement. Someone mentioning clarity of the term stolen, what that means, the idea of presence, enabling our presence, the ability to do the jobs that we're doing. How does all that happen? What's the precondition for that? Noting the connection between it and the mission of the university, which I think underscores one of the kind of goals that we've called up around the institution.
Joseph, thank you for posting that it's an ongoing process and not in the past. That's really important.
Yeah.
Also, let's see, Kelly, you wrote inclusive and holistic, yet leaves space for it to expand, which I think is also nailing or hitting the nail on the head in this conversation of the idea that we're really working on a healing aspect of decolonization.
I'll note the comment that some folks are bothered by land acknowledgements or might consider them to be tokenizing or patronizing. And I'm certainly aware of discussions within Native communities on this very issue, that folks fall on multiple sides of that. And I think that part of our purpose in even thinking about and doing what we're doing right now is to avoid the simple reading of a script, tossing the paper aside and moving forward kind of approach to a land acknowledgement.
You know, I don't like formalistic statements, really, because, I mean, okay, they're fine. We acknowledge that we are on stolen land that is forcibly appropriated. So what concretely are we going to do about either returning the land, which I'm sure nobody really wants to do, or compensating the people appropriately for the land that was stolen? I think that's the crux of the matter, you know. So saying that, yeah, we are on stolen land and whatever, I don't know. I think if I was the person whose land was stolen, I'd find that more problematic, you know, if it's not followed up by, okay, we are now going to determine what the proper value of the land is and compensate and apologize, you know. So it's a whole slew of things. Acknowledging alone doesn't cut it for me. And it's actually very traumatizing because I come from a colonized country, you know, and I know the horrors that were visited and how it has generational impact.
I 100%, I agree with what you're saying. There's a lot of work to do beyond just saying the words. Because the university, UVO, sits on Kalapuya land and I am Kalapuya, I appreciate those acknowledgements at the beginning of a lecture or a speech. I've never felt tokenized or it wasn't enough. It kind of gives space in the room suddenly for that thought. So I'm willing to hear other people's sides that it's not productive, but I'll just say that it is on my side and that I feel kind of a sense of pride to hear, oh, my tribe's being acknowledged in this discussion from the get-go. It feels less of that erasure that's happened my whole life. And I don't expect the speaker or that thing that we're doing to solve the stolen land problem. That's a huge, you know, that's part of the bigger conversation. And not that it shouldn't happen. There has to be compensation. There has to be healing and trauma that needs to be fixed. But I would say a land acknowledgement for me feels good.
I would also point, and this was called up in the comments, that I tend to hear a lot of acknowledgments that frame it as something that happened in the past, some kind of event, and that it's over and okay, we'll acknowledge it and, wash our hands and go. And I think that the value of what we heard today and others that are coming forward is that this is a structure that's been built into the very system that we live in, and that is a precondition, an ongoing systematic operation that's taking place that allows so much of what we do to happen. And that's true not just of land, but of labor and other issues that are connected. And I always like to, usually if I'm in a room and if I've been asked to do an acknowledgement and they'll hand me a script, I usually fold it up and set it aside. And I kind of do my own version and talk about that there are still people who live on this land, who are native, who are part of our institution, who are native, who are contributing their labor and who are contributing in ways beyond what they ought to do to help educate people. And I just want to call up Kaylee's point that, I completely agree that the idea of returning land and sovereignty and power is like a goal, but we have to begin with the very fundamental problem of erasure. That settler colonialism erases not just what happened, but the ongoing patterns of oppression and discrimination. And I think the acknowledgement is an opening towards making that visible and explicit. And it's kind of a touchstone to do more work. And I think that that was a piece that Kaylee articulated. And that's kind of why we're spending time with this, so that we don't just say it, but we think about how do we use it to enable ongoing work of a more forceful nature to actually go after some of these structures that have been built in. But just that opening moment of acknowledging erasure and acknowledging presence, I think is a starting place that I want to call up for us to think about in our teaching. And I think that this is also something that we want to engage today is that, it's not enough to just put a statement on a syllabus or just to say it on a first day of class, but we have to engage in acts in our teaching that take people a little more deeply and systematically into the issue. And the acknowledgement's like a starting place for that. It's a stepping stone, I think. So I just wanted to call that out and certainly acknowledge, I absolutely hear those who find them problematic. And again, certain Native folks have expressed that, but others have talked about the kind of work that they do that's constructive and positive.
I think and Jason, you make a good point. People will lie on either side. I think a lot of it comes down to the sincerity of it too. So if you kind of coldly read a script, it's not as effective. But if you're still doing it from a good place to say, here's my part in this as a teacher, as a professor, as someone with a voice to a ton of people, I think that comes from a genuine spot and is not adding to trauma. But again, it's more of the discussion you said, Jason, of using that as a jumping off point.
Yeah, and this starts to move us into how we mobilize these issues in our teaching. How are we to engage students in them? And as a way to kind of bring us to that consideration, there's going to be time today where we break into smaller groups and really kind of talk about like specific strategies that you can engage in your teaching and what you might need to support that work. But before we get there, we want to kind of maybe put ourselves on a common ground about what we mean by some of the terms. And so we wanted to just talk a little bit about language, because a land acknowledgement is about language. We've been talking about some of the terms and words that were used, the sincerity or intentionality of those words. And when it comes to the actual content of engaging these issues, we just wanted to maybe shift a little bit into some of the terms that we encounter in scholarship or that we might be asking students to read and learn about. And probably the first one that we'll note is just this term settler colonialism. and what we mean by that. And I thought that I might share my screen one more time and put up what I would call a working definition of settler colonialism, because I think it's contested. I'm certainly, and I do work in Black studies as well, and I'm certainly very aware of this excellent article by Robin D.G. Kelly, who kind of calls out that folks don't think of settler colonialism in terms of Africa, except for South Africa. So I want to just acknowledge that it's a contested term, but I think if we have a kind of working understanding of it will be helpful. So let me just share my screen one more time and provide a definition that's kind of a working definition. If I can get my screen to advance for me. So, and this is one that I use with students in my own classroom. And just to emphasize that it's an ongoing system of power and logic of elimination, and it perpetuates genocide, repression, and erasure of native peoples, cultures, histories, and ties to land. And that's a precondition for settler expropriation of lands and exploitation of resources. So there's a lot packed into that. What I don't want to do is like unpack all that here. I just want to put it forward as a kind of working definition about what we mean when we use settler colonialism. And so I can, I'm going to stop my share. I'm happy to place that into the chat as well. But I want to maybe invite my colleague Kaylee to add her thoughts on that, and then maybe we can hear a little bit from folks.
I honestly don't have a lot to say about that one. More that you covered it. That it's contested. It's kind of one of my, I don't want to say go-tos, but I feel like it captures it really well when we're talking about some of the issues at the heart of just what's going on systematically in academia, in policy, and things like that. Settler colonialism is just a good one for me that captures it. So if it doesn't make sense, I hope that at the end we have a better understanding of how that plays, like interplays.
Yeah. I wonder if we might also, I mean, I want to invite folks, okay, here we have a question I see in the chat about how do we distinguish settler colonialism from plain vanilla colonialism? And I think that's a great question, and I want to put that out there for us. I mean, I don't want to just be me talking here. So I'm curious what folks think based on your understanding. How do we distinguish? And I'll note that it's distinguish. It's not saying that they're separate. It's just, how do we distinguish?
Well, in African studies, settler colonialism is where the settlers say that this is their home now and they're not going away. And they actually appropriate the best land, the most of the resources, if not all, and marginalize and brutalize and authorize the owners of the land. The other kind of colonialism, which, I mean, I'm African, so I'm Nigerian, which is in West Africa. West Africa wasn't ideal for white people to settle in because malaria and a lot of tropical diseases were killing them. So they never thought of those places as places where they would stay. What they wanted was to plunder. And, by virtue of international law, a lot of the natural resources also ended up belonging to them and their corporations, which is why Africa is poor and white people in Europe and the Americas are rich, So now there's this kind of colonialism where nobody needs to be anywhere physically to plunder, and the multinational corporations and transnationals do that. But there's a system of laws that supports both the settler colonialism and the non-settler colonialism and legitimizes ownership structures that we have all accepted as law, you know. It dispossesses the owners of the land and gives the resources to even people, you know, to the colonizers.
Excellent. Reiterate what I see in the chat, the thanks for those distinctions. And I especially appreciate bringing up the structures of law that really institutionalize and systematize these structures. So I think that's a really important point. I also want to note something that I really talk about with my students a lot is this notion that settler colonialism kind of normalizes that for settlers so that the land they're on becomes their home. And I think that like they make it their home and have whole cultures around that and traditions around that. But that's all built on, and the precondition of that is the erasure of the cultures and traditions that are there. So that I think is an important piece as well in that distinction. We as facilitators also thought it might be useful to hear questions or to talk about distinctions in terms about when we engage Native perspectives, the kinds of terms that we use for people. And I know that when I first started learning this, it was American Indian, and then it was Native American, and then I've heard Indigenous. What term do we use? And we wanted to put that out as a kind of question, as something to consider, because we in our teaching are going to come across different readings that use different terms, and we'll have students coming from different places who will be using different terms. So what's up with that? What do we do?
Oh, I'm getting prompted. So I am, because I'm Kalapuya, I prefer to just use the actual tribe name itself, if you know that. And that can be, you know, tricky if you don't. But if you know what tribe the person is that you're talking to, use that. Past that, I don't like joining the word American, so Native American or American Indian. I prefer just Native. Again, that's a preference. We had a long discussion, and I will bring this out now, as in Jason and Dan and I, when we were discussing this. I worked in DC with a lot of the old guard Native folks who have no problem with the word Indian. It's in the name, Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's no, they don't bat an eye. I was like, hold on, why are we just throwing the word Indian around all the time? I mean, it's everywhere. My older relatives, they have no problem with it. So I just want to say it's a progression even within tribal folks themselves to like what they deem as offensive or not offensive. So I would just caution that if you come across an older Native folk who say, yeah, me and, you know, and they refer to the collective as Indians, just be aware that it's not offensive to them. They're not harmed or traumatized by that word. You could meet people of my age or younger who grew up with their family members using that reference term as well, but still prefer in discussion to not. I know that's not necessarily clearing the air on the topic, but to give a perspective of within the discussion, it gets difficult straddling both lines of my family, other folks that are Native, and then academics and community members. And I err on just always being general, and Indigenous is fine, but it's kind of a more global perspective. Native just doesn't attach the word American. Any thoughts on that? I'm willing to hear other people out.
If I can interject and just offer another part of the conversation that we had as a group when we were planning, you know, it's always a good idea to ask. If you're unclear, it's often the best practice to ask what people prefer. And I know that can sound very simple, but you know, it can also trigger a much deeper conversation about what people prefer and also why. So when we were talking yesterday, as we were planning for this meeting, and Kaylee was sharing about her experiences in Washington and her, experiences as growing up, there was a lot of richness in that conversation that helps me to guide as a non-Indigenous person where I should go with it. And I think that was like worth it for me, but also to recognize that these terms change. They change in the United States, they change around the world. If you go to Canada, the preferred nomenclature and terminology is different. There it might be First Nation or it might be Métis, depending on the context. And so when you are in these situations or in these circumstances, it's really best just to ask, and be open to that conversation, but also be open to, if you get called out a little bit, to not get defensive and say, "Oh, I'm sorry," like, because there are intergenerational divides throughout communities that are really important to be conscious of. And so even if one, you don't want a situation where one person is taken as speaking for the collective. And so as a hopeful ally, as somebody who's working on being a good ally, I think that is a plan that I have tried to use in Oregon, and I'm trying to bring here. So.
And I would also, to build on that, thank you, Dan, for that. And Kaylee, the comment in the chat about that there are students at Brooklyn College who are coming from outside of what we call the United States, who are coming as Indigenous Native students. And I mean, I think this is an important piece, especially when helping students who do not have background in this, to think about. So it starts to point to indigeneity as a global kind of phenomenon, but it's also here in the United States, in our communities, that kind of people coming from different places, and recognizing that, I think, is an important distinction. So we don't just kind of have the Americanization of it, to put it that way. And, at least in my own teaching, I usually I certainly engage Native perspectives here in the US, and particularly in my region, like right here where we are, the actual land. But it's also pointing to cases in places outside the United States as well, to help reinforce that we're talking about the kind of structures that was shared earlier. These are structures of power, and they aren't just in our place. They're global in nature, and it helps kind of reinforce that point too. So I want to appreciate that, and acknowledge that even in our students, they're coming from these different places. That's great. I want to ask if there's any other kinds of questions around terms that folks encounter, or that you are curious about or uncertain about.
There's one in the chat, Jason.
I may have missed it.
From Gregory. It's up a few, but I've actually not heard that term, to be honest.
Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah. The term BIPOC. This is certainly one that's you're hearing a lot of now. So Black, Indigenous, people of color. There are certain groups that are not included in those letters, to keep that in mind. So, Arab students, or students from other certain regions of the world, who nevertheless are at the brunt of oppressive forces in our country. A term like that, I'll just give my take on it. It's the same kind of take I do around Native terms. I like to find out what folks think. I know plenty of students here who are like, I am not a person of color, I am Black. And they're very, adamant about that. And then others who are like, person of color is fine. So, I think finding out, asking, but the deeper point is like being aware that terminology it has its advantages, but it also signifies things, and it starts, I don't need to tell you all how language and power works, but being aware of that fundamentally. And I certainly would open up to what others think about that term. I honestly have not done enough investigation of the term BIPOC and talked with enough students and folks about the term. I certainly am seeing it used a lot. I don't really use it because it's just not part of my nomenclature and training. I'm seeing a great the Code Switch podcast about the term. I'll have to check that out. Thank you for that link and reference.
And also, before we move on to the next thing, I do want to remind people the chat is also recorded when you record. And so just be aware that if there are resources in the chat, those will be preserved. And I think I may try to scroll through at the end and collect up a lot of these really amazing things that have been posted.
I'm collecting as we go, and we'll send that out to everybody.
Maddie is always ahead of me.
Wonderful. A question just came up that I want to call up about. At the beginning of a course, would it be a good idea to start off with a land acknowledgement and then go into a discussion of terms like we are doing now? So as I like to do with faculty is to put that back. What do you think? How would that feel for you? Would that make sense? Would that work? Those of you who use them or do this, how do you do it? Are there other ways into the discussion? So I'm seeing in the chat, it's there and then asking about it. So provoking a discussion with it. And then folks are talking about bringing in some text, and we're starting to anticipate a little later where we're going to capture some of these ideas, these nice specific ideas. I tend to make reference to my teaching maybe too much, but in my own class, I actually don't begin with a formal statement. I have my students do a kind of existential experiential exercise. So if I'm in an I have to think how I'm going to do this with a remote course, but when I'm in an in-person class, I engage students in literally moving about the room and telling me what is real about this room? What do you see of nature in this room? I keep kind of a broad question, and I start hearing what they say, and I can almost always anticipate that they do not see the historical structures that make the room possible. Some do, but most don't. They literally take the objects in the room and talk about them. But then I talk about, well, what's underneath the floor? What about the soil? What about the people who used to live on the soil? What about the labor that keeps the room clean? Who built these things? What about the labor that assembles this electronic device that's projecting my slide right now? Like, I start opening questions like this, and this gets me in. This is my way of kind of provoking it and then getting into land acknowledgement. But I guess it's a principle of I want to see where students are at and what they bring into the room. And occasionally I get students who will note it, but usually I can anticipate that they won't. So that's just one way I do it. Then I move into a discussion of land acknowledgement and talk about that, and so on. But that's just another way. That's just one way. I'm seeing some great comments in the chat too. It's really good. The last thing I would say, and I'm not certain about in your context, but at the University of Oregon, honestly, land acknowledgements are a relatively new phenomenon. And so years ago, they just weren't part of what happened, and people didn't, I think, really think about them or how to use them. And students certainly did not come into classrooms having heard land acknowledgements, whereas now when they go to their orientations or different sessions, they are more part of the orientation culture. There's certain kinds of ways in which they get done, maybe without as much sincerity or depth as we would like to pull up that conversation again, but they're more aware of these things. And so I think it puts more of an onus on it as an instructor when engaging Indigenous and Native perspectives to talk about that land acknowledgement that they've heard, and to maybe put a little more context and background to it than what they get by just having a script read to them. And excellent. I'm also seeing pulling up work in decolonial theory, like Annie Balchiano's work in Coloniality of Power, Eurocentric Thinking, another great connection on this topic. Thank you for that contribution in the chat. Use that work in my class too, so encourage others to engage and learn.
Jason,
Kaylee, please, yeah.
I wasn't sure where you're gonna go. Maybe we're heading the same way. But what I was gonna kind of bring in some of the goals, and some of this starts the next part of when you open up the class from the get-go with a discussion and an understanding and a grounding. Even if the course is not even related to Native studies on the broad scale, later on in class, when someone wants to make a link, or someone has an objection, or maybe has a point of view that the rest of the class isn't familiar with or used to, the fact that it was already opened, at least from day one. So for me, like I said, it's not like there's a wrong way to start a class with a land acknowledgement or a discussion or a question. The wrong way to do it is to just never have that. So then later, when I was studying things that, my biggest one I could think of is law, because I'm in it, but it was my undergrad law class, where we're talking about these principles and ideas of land and ownership. And I'm like, well, hey, but what about the tribes? And the professor was like, that's not what we talk about here. And it was just this complete ignoring, omission. And, I was pretty upset. I was more mad than like feeling traumatized. I was just pissed, where I was like, what? So I think that just not having the space to ever feel comfortable to bring it up, it kind of shied me away for sure later on. When do you approach a professor privately then? But then the rest of the class misses that moment where they're like, oh, there is a bigger discussion. So anyways, all that being said, that it's a really fantastic way to have space. And then later, how teaching and having space for that promotes the healing concept that we're really, really driving forward, of not just doing the status quo to be politically correct, to be inclusive, but to be actually building like the bridge and the gap. And that's, I think, what gets me the most excited about this workshop. But Jason, you were about to make a point. I might have jumped ahead.
No, I think you are actually spot on, is because what I wanted to note is that, one piece of work that a land acknowledgement does, or putting these things forward, and I will note that land acknowledgements may be like one piece. Like, I think there's other things that we want to open up in the class. Like, there's other core issues related to this. I think this session's part of a larger anti-racist work that's happening on your campus. So there's other issues that are bound up with settler colonialism in this country. It's a bit reductive, but it has a provocation. Patrick Wolf's notion of red land plus black labor equals white wealth. That's very simplified, of course, but it points to the fact that these things are bound up with other issues. So the point I wanted to make is that it's opening up a space within our classroom in order to engage these issues, or to invite folks coming from them with their perspective. So it's not just that we're talking about them, but we're issuing an invitation to hear from those perspectives. And moreover, I think, at least for me, it is to empower students to take up the work of the course in their own work, in the work that they're doing as students in their own ways. But we're opening that space. And I think a land acknowledgement helps do that work, much like Kaylee was saying. And then we can keep returning to that at different moments in the class, depending on the issue, depending on what it is that we're engaging, because it's there now, it's been named. And I think that's a core principle. Alongside of that, and this is kind of where we want to take the discussion for a little bit, is that doing this work, it is charged for very good reasons. And that comes with emotionality. When we are building these kinds of relationships or this kind of learning community, it's full of emotions, this kind of teaching, especially for certain of our students, and for a variety of reasons. And so we wanted to just mention a little bit about the kind of emotionality that's bound up in the work. I know my colleague Kaylee has some things to say about that. And I'm sure that some of you are probably have experiences even in teaching this, that the emotions that can come with it. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that before we take a quick break and then get you into thinking about how you're going to do this in your own classes. Kaylee, would you want to share a little bit on this now? Would that?
Yeah, I'll share. So then we can break and kind of like process that. I just, very much understand the emotion can be anger, can be sadness, can be just quiet. There's a lot that gets in these discussions, and I've experienced a whole array of them, depending on the classroom, depending on the topic. So it's a mixture of just acknowledging it to you guys that I still get weepy, I still get mad, I still feel a lot of things around these conversations, even though I've spent a huge chunk of my life and time trying to grapple it and be prepared for them. It still catches me off guard, and all of a sudden I'm like reacting emotionally. And so it's okay. And I don't know if anyone else wants to be as emotional as me, but please join me. I don't mind. And that to be aware then as a teacher or someone engaging in discussion, if someone gets charged, hopefully that it doesn't completely destroy the conversation or break down the point that people are getting at, and that it can be a time to step back, be kind to that person, and could really create like a huge for them. Professors that were kind, professors that heard me out, that said, oh, that is a new point of view, and I'm not going to let that make me feel uncomfortable. So there's a lot there. Like I said, it's just that when we talk about this, to not forget that it's emotional, to not get too wordsy, to not get too academic about it, and to remember there's a lot of feelings in it and in this discussion. I think that's all.
I think to build off that, when we were speaking about this workshop yesterday, this conversation that was related to me kept coming to mind, where a graduate student colleague of mine at the University of Oregon was getting very upset about a project because this stuff can be upsetting. And she went to an Indigenous faculty member at Oregon who stopped her when she was, kind of venting and letting it all out, and said, is your approach healing? Right? Is your approach healing? And it's such a simple statement. Is your approach, is your response healing? And it's something that I've carried with me throughout the years, to talk about things like this, but also just it's come in handy across context, this term in particular, when you have a lot of students who are in crisis, dealing with incredibly complicated and saddening life situations of, a million types. It's like every other day there's another one. And so the pedagogical approach of, is your response healing, is something that I found to have affected my pedagogy in a positive way, both when dealing with subjects like this, both with teaching about subjects like this, but also in general. And that's a real takeaway for me about trying to build relationships with students in a way that is mutually beneficial and healing. And when we talk about things like my experience in class being challenged by Kaylee, And how do you react, right? You have a student who's saying something that's fundamentally opposed to the way that most students understand the world. Do you try to push it aside? Do you try to stick with the curriculum, or do you say, okay, let's talk about it in a way that invites that kind of conversation? And I'm going to just editorialize a bit and tell an anecdote. I mean, there was one other student in the class who was had returned to school from a very conservative community, and really began going. He and Kaylee started going after each other. But that conversation turned very productive. And my last year of grad school, I would often walk by the off-campus bar at the University of Oregon, and there they'd be having these conversations and allowing them to expand. And I think that exercising flexibility and a little bit of empathy is a really important goal in moving the process towards healing.
I think that's excellent. And, that points to a whole other workshop, a whole nother session on this very topic. So, I mean, part of our goal here, as mentioned, was to kind of seed a teaching culture. And so not only are these wonderful archive of resources coming up in the chat, but I think some of the key support pieces needed to do this kind of teaching and learning well, or as well as we can, are also emerging to kind of seed ideas for that ongoing development and work. I know we're right at the top of the hour, and we wanted to introduce a short moment, like a few minutes, like a 5-minute stretch break for folks to move about. I don't know, Dan, if you were going to queue up something fun, but we wanted to take a bit of a moment to move our bodies and move our minds in a little different way. And then when we come back, we'll be inviting you into having an opportunity to work together in some smaller groups to begin really taking these ideas that we've been discussing, as well as the things you're already doing, and think about how you can begin to design and enact that in your own courses. So let's come back at about 10:07 or so in about 5 minutes. And then we can also take up that question about grades that came in the chat at that time.
Just to insert a moment of levity, when we were talking yesterday about what we would do in this break, I was channeling my 5-year-old's Zoom kindergarten PE teacher, Miss Carlotti, about possibly doing the chicken dance, which is her go-to to get the kids up and moving. But on second thought, I decided that was probably wouldn't be appreciated.
Might I suggest Go Noodle TV, which is also an excellent way to get your body from elementary school teachers.
Going noodle, love it.
I often feel such a sense of sympathy for Ms. Carlotti, who has to do PE with 5 grades worth of kids at the same time over Zoom. It's unbelievable. All right, let's give, we'll probably be coming back in a few seconds. So All right. Can I ask a question while the facilitators are getting prepared to come back? How bad is the snow today?
The best.
I mean, I don't say bad in a normative or pejorative sense. I say like, how much is it?
Oh, how much? That's a different question.
Yeah, it's gorgeous outside. I agree, whoever said that.
Yeah. I had went through all my elementary to high school in New York City, and I had 2 snow days my entire time. And they were both in 1996 when I was a senior in high school. So whenever I hear anything about snow days in New York, I feel like my childhood lost a component.
I'll just say I had 2 weeks off of school for the blizzard of 1978. And it was like the apex of my childhood.
And here's, Jason, Kaylee, are you ready?
Are we all ready? Is everybody ready to go? We have our last bit here. We thought it might be useful just to kind of summarize some key points from the first hour of our time, and then maybe extend a little bit more on the discussion around the emotions and healing, and then move into strategizing some concrete things that you can do in your teaching. And I, just want to bring up that, a point of emphasis from the first part was to move beyond the continuing erasure by bringing forward in an explicit and visible way Native perspectives and experience. And so the land acknowledgement being one tool towards that end, paying attention to the kind of terminology that we're using or encountering as we're engaging students in learning, and kind of clarifying what those terms can mean and the context in which they're being used, connecting this work up with structures of power and the kinds of assumptions that people bring as a result of living through those structures. Part of decolonization is dismantling that connection, making it visible as much as possible. And of course, being aware of transformation and change over time in terms of experiences and generational differences, as well as the kind of diversity that comes. So when we say like Native students, who do we mean? That's a diverse number of folks. And also, we were kind of finished our first part together talking about emotions and developing relationships and this process of healing that we are here to kind of promote, and opening up a space where that work can take place and even flourish. And I had received a question about, when we do open that up towards a process of healing, what's a way to kind of deepen that and avoid it being just a kind of individualized phenomenon. And so I thought it might be worth our time to discuss a little bit more. And like I mentioned, that can be an entire workshop itself to really take that into depth. But it seems like we have the time to engage that for a little bit more here together. And I just wanted to, I'm always, like I said, I love to learn, and I'm really curious to hear from folks your thoughts on this question. If we open up a space to engage emotions, relationships, and foster a sense of healing, how can we do that in a way that isn't just a kind of individualized experience, but something maybe more collective, something that is connected up with the structures of power that we're talking about?
Well, I'll expand a little bit on the question. Tell me why maybe individualization is not the goal, because that individualization, I think, can bring out the collective. but to make the jump could be harder. So it took me feeling empowered individually for a while before I wanted to engage in the further discussions or to be part of something bigger. Doesn't mean that we should exclude the collective, but I just think like if you guys are thinking about it, maybe understand that individualism isn't bad. Does that make sense?
Actually just wanted to highlight this comment from Michael Greer. They say, I get anxiety about students feeling like talking about healing isn't doing philosophy or isn't the education they paid for. I think that's a really powerful point, and one that we should try to encourage students to unlearn, right? That building community, establishing relevance, seeing yourself as part of a greater whole can happen in a lot of different ways, but that's a valuable educational experience. Learning how to be empathetic, not having to be the smartest person in the room at all times. And I think that what is education is really implicated by that comment. And, you know, trying to normalize the idea that thinking about relationships with other people, but also other people's relationships with the world around them, and how those work is fundamental to education. I mean, I don't teach philosophy. I don't really know that much about philosophy, but I would imagine that if you do teach philosophy, relationships between things and people and their world is probably pretty integral. And so, you know, my classes, I was warned once to not say seeing the world through other people's shoes, especially in connection with Indigenous studies, because there's a whole lot of loaded meanings with that term. But seeing the world and understanding that other people see the world differently than how you do is, to me, a fundamental part of education. And having students recognize and being explicit about, we're not talking about, I'm just going to pick we're not talking about Wittgenstein to pick a philosopher that springs to mind, but we are going to talk about how we understand the world and each other seems like really part of the goal of healing. Did I see Professor Okome, did your hand go up?
Well, you know, the whole essence of education also is that we are not all going to feel the same way about things. So I don't know. I don't think there's any utility in saying that people should not remain angry, you know, because everybody has their, you know, their process. So there'll be angry people, there'll be turned off people, there'll be people who feel that this is nothing to do with them, and every view should be welcome, you know. And I don't also see any use in performing harmony if people are really not feeling harmonious, you know. So I think the essence of teaching such courses is to enable each person to express their genuine situation at that point in time. And it might change over time. But frankly, I mean, I'm African, like I said, I'm still angry. And I know they're forgiving people. There are people who feel that it's, you know, this stuff is anger making. And it's okay for people to be forgiving. I don't have any problem with that, you know. But there is a whole lot of stuff that comes with the, in the aftermath and in the process of colonization that's still ongoing, that when you engage as a scholar, as a student, a lot of those, the hierarchies are reproduced as the norm, you know, and dislocating it takes a lot of work because you are the one that is the outsider. So if a student is feeling frustrated or angry or whatever, I mean, I think they should be able to talk about it and one can say, suggest things. Frankly, also students have been angry with me. I've had an African-American student who said, I came and took African-American jobs. I'm an African, I'm an outsider. People worked for affirmative action and I'm waltzing in to take, and it's fine. We can engage, we can talk about it. He was angry most of the semester, and I don't see any reason to shut down people or to say that this is the way you should be thinking about this. Actually, you can suggest ways people can think about stuff. You can't suggest ways they should feel about things, because they know best how they feel. And you have to get to a point where you process how you're going to manage those. And you can suggest strategies, or you can't say people should just forget or forgive or whatever, or heal. When, a lot of the problems created by the original colonization are ongoing and actually worsening.
Can I don't know, I had a question before that became a comment. So it might be a comment. But I just wanted to, like, in this discussion that we're having right now, two things are coming up for me. One is, well, maybe it's more than two things, but one is linking back to the very beginning, something that Kaylee said right in the very beginning about kind of knowledge, and you were talking about expertise, or you were framing yourself as not an expert. And just, I think that when we're thinking about emotion and how emotion works into our learning spaces, part of what we're talking about is what counts as knowledge, and about, also kind of questioning and or staying nimble and keeping our knees bent around who holds expertise. And so when we frame our whole classes from the get in a way and communicate to our students that we all, hold expertise, that we're all bringing, and that knowledge, like emotions is a form of knowledge. Knowledge exists in lots of different scale and different planes. We hold it in different parts of our bodies, and that we design our entire class to honor those different knowledges, or to make space, or to hold containers. So it's about the scaffolds we create, the containers the spaces we create and hold with students. And then the other thing that is coming up is just what is so important. This also feels a little abstract for me. The discussion, I know, because I know so many of the work you all do, and I think it's this part, like I'm hungry to, like, I know, like, just I'll be specific with each other, because we are, and I think particularly in this past year, we've had this opportunity to be thinking so carefully together in a lot of ways around our teaching in ways we haven't necessarily always carved out space for prior to the pandemic. And so makes me feel like, okay, what would be, well, it's this, we need, and what's happening in the chat here, it's like so generative to exchange ideas with each other. We have so much, all of us in this room bring so much experience and skill, and also questions and critical experiences and mistakes. Like, we bring all these things that could be really helpful for each other. And so I guess I'm just flagging that we have been trying, and we continue to try to create spaces where we can all exchange in an ongoing way. And it does feel just really important. And that the work that Jason and Kaylee are holding up right now as being kind of vital, like fundamental, like lifeblood necessary for our students and for each other and for our institution as a just institution, that part of that work is creating spaces and participating in spaces where we can exchange ideas in an ongoing way. So it's not about an idea and then doing it, but like the actual practice and praxis of exchanging and building knowledge with each other.
Oh, please go ahead, Brian.
Um, so one of the things that I think in my experience, I mean, I teach classics, so I teach sort of things that are anchored in the ancient world. One of the things that we talk about as a department is that by sort of transporting students into moments that are 2,500 plus years ago, it creates an illusion that it's safe in some way to talk about issues. And one of the things that I'm really interested in when it comes to settler colonialism and introducing that into the curriculum is like a core part of one of our classes that we recently rebranded as Tyranny, Democracy, Empire. So it's really fertile to talk about stuff, is to introduce Greek colonialism from, let's say, 700 BC, and asking the students not just to know about what happened, but to sit for a moment in the emotional reactions that the native people are likely going to have, and the variety of emotions that people are going to have, the variety of experiences that they're going to have, and then allowing that just to like, let's get it all on the board, let's write all of it, and allow that to sort of exist for a second. And then when inevitably the shift turns to sort of modernity, not just sort of more recent history, but then also the present moment, the ongoing present moment, where those same issues are at stake, the same feelings and experiences are at stake. It, in my view and experience talking about other issues, it really makes it sort of so that something really kind of, I don't want to say like beautiful happens in the classroom, because we've allowed the ancient world and all of those experiences to just exist without people having too much invested in it. And then to shift that into the present moment and to see sort of the way that trauma is continuing to be realized is at least just my experience in the classroom, it becomes almost sublime.
I'm going to thank everyone for for this input, and I think it's a good segue to be thinking about concretely some of the strategies that we employ in our teaching, because it's one thing to just have an idea about what I want to do, but I have to think about the full context of that. And so this emotionality piece is part of that context. And kind of I guess, a concrete strategy that I will put forward as an example before sending us out into breakout rooms relates very specifically to this one, which is I like to model for my students some of the kind of thinking or moves that I'm putting them into an opportunity to try out themselves. And so around this notion of knowledge and expertise and emotionality, I will usually talk about how did I come to learn about these issues? And then I will usually put up, there's different forms of knowledge or ways I engage them. I can engage them as someone who knows the scholarship, and on a continuum from I don't know anything to I know a lot, I'm farther along on the know a lot. There's still more I need to learn. When it comes to my experiential knowledge of these things, I'm way lower down. I am not a native person. I do not experience them in that way. But I know there's folks in the room who are farther along on that continuum. Same thing with emotionality. I can place myself, where am I in terms of my emotions on this? And then I can talk about why that matters and how that contributes to how I engage, think about, and learn these issues. And so I will usually model that for students. And this is part of like giving permission to students to be able to think that and to give voice to that, and then to create these containers or outlets for students to literally be able to articulate that. Sometimes that's in writing exercises, sometimes that's in discussions. But so for me, modeling some of the forms and types of knowledge and where I fall on that spectrum is just one strategy I use when framing and introducing these kinds of topics. So what we would like to do is to give you an opportunity, probably a good solid 8 to 10 minutes in a breakout group, to think through some of the ways that you want to begin, at least one way that you want to begin engaging settler colonialism and Native perspectives in your class. And it may be that if you already do this, something you want to change or something you want to add or extend. But what I'm going to do is place a link in the chat that's going to open up a shared document. It's a set of PowerPoint slides that have some prompts there that ask you, what's your idea? What do you need to support you in teaching it? And what are some concerns that you have about it? And then by doing it this way and getting that down, typing that down, will create an archive of ideas that will serve as a reference point that you will have moving forward. And it's also just a way to capture what your group is going to discuss together in your teaching. So again, the goal is to really focus specifically on at least one concrete strategy that you can begin to include in your course or extend in some way in your course. So I'm going to post the link. I believe it should open for everybody, I hope. And then I'm going to call on, I believe it's Maddie maybe, who can do the breakouts. And is there any, someone maybe had a question? Did I miss? And I think it seems reasonable to do maybe groups the size of around 3 to 4-ish.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna check. I'll do that.
And
yeah.
to find your slide, sorry, Maddie, when you go to breakout, you'll have a group number. Just go to that slide number for your group.
And how long are we giving everybody, Jason?
I think we should do like around 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and debrief these discussions. And that's going to kind of bring us into a concluding moment of our time today.
Okay, I'm doing rooms now.
In Zoom are never long enough, particularly on this particular topic, but we have 15 minutes yet together this morning, for me, afternoon for you. And I want to just kind of put out there to call up if anyone in a group wants to share like one specific idea you discussed that you think sounded really fruitful and interesting. And while that's happening, I'm going to be perusing what got captured in the slides, but I just want to kind of open it up and just kind of hear what's that specific idea. You're also welcome to drop that in the chat as well. I'm going to be forced to call on group 1 because it was called out as being pretty rad. So if I see that as a teacher, I'm like, okay, group 1, you're on. What's that cool idea that came up in your group?
Group 1, is that, oh, okay. Well, one thing that I think I dropped this in the chat, but one thing that I noticed has sort of worked, I teach geography and I teach classes that are about urban, how the urban is shaped and who shapes it. So, I've been doing a little bit of this, but this crowdsourced map, it's called nativeland.ca. And I would like to know if other people have seen this or critiques of it, but I often try to use this because it shows use that in the beginning with the urban myth of the sale of Manhattan to Europeans, right? And I talk about that as like one of the first sort of urban myths. And I talk about the ways that territories are thought of differently in different cultures, and I use that as a counterexample to the idea of private property and things like that. And that seems to help kind of visualize a bit. And it's also crowdsourced. So like to Maddie's point, it's not that it's the expertise, right? It's not like, oh, okay, this is expert knowledge from, you know, an academic source, et cetera. It's also kind of embodies the fact that tribes still exist, right? The idea that this is not in the past, that this is happening right now. It's a process. So I don't know what else. Oh, nice. Thanks, Joseph.
Great.
So group
Other
three
groups?
started, group three started talking about the importance of critically analyzing the canon in the particular discipline or field that you're teaching, and asking, why are all of the social theorists or the art historians that are typically studied of a particular part of Europe, and usually of one gender, right? And so then using that as a springboard to introduce indigenous theorists, writers, etc., and then explain why that's important.
Very good. Yes. I mean, that speaks beyond, I mean, that speaks to the idea of a teaching culture, to have that reinforced in more than just that class, that very idea, and then even institutionally, like the institution of the disciplines themselves, of knowledge formation, of what counts. It speaks to that too. Nice.
We wanted to.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead, Donna.
Go.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I mean, I think we're in group 9. I think we totally forgot the numbers, but we had an interesting conversation about, setting the tone in the classroom, and the fact that many of us have those, first couple of sessions where we are sort of talking about how we're going to orient our course and what would it look like to invite students to sort of come up with a set of questions where we can consider who is disadvantaged, who is left out, how is the discourse around this even shaping our experience. And then also, I think, centering their experiential knowledge as here's where we can all start, but then here's where we can think about where we want to end up. And I was making the point that I found that through sort of teaching online, I've never really invited students to self-assess themselves as learners or set their own goals for the course. And I think that's an interesting way to sort of invite them to sort of consider, what do I want to walk away with from this course? And I think there's some ways in which we might engage some student learners who may not be inspired by the content enough, or just by the content. But that was our sort of, conversation about what are some ways that we can invite students to develop a set of questions where we can always come back to these concepts. So we can introduce all these ideas, but then if we're reading 7 weeks later and we're not able to say, well, this author may be talking from this background and knowledge, and it disadvantages this group, or it shapes the discourse around this discipline in this way, then how are we sort of keeping those connections from start to finish? And so that's where we were.
Was there someone else right before Donna as well that was going to say something?
I was going to say something that has been on my mind as we started to prepare for this workshop, and then I think got raised again in this question about like where knowledge is, who has it, what knowledge gets valued by the university. And I think one of the things that's at stake for me anyway, in thinking about settler colonialism and indigenous perspectives, is that we got to think about the university. Remember, the university itself is a machine of colonialism and settler colonialism, right? The idea of, the easiest way to think of it is the idea of the land grant university, right? So many American universities were founded, very explicitly on land that was stolen. Mm-hmm. And I think that this work asks us to rethink the university. It's not simply a matter of bringing outside knowledge into the university on the terms that the university has set. That wouldn't be good enough at the end of the day. And then we have to think about how to trouble and undo and rebuild the university, the knowledge that it has, the way that we think about what knowledge is and who has it. So I think I like for us to just keep that in mind. I think there's a really transformative horizon that's out there for us in terms of thinking about the relationship between these perspectives and this knowledge and the university itself. It's not simply a matter of including one extra group or identity right into a kind of multicultural frame.
So good, Joseph. That's kind of where we were gonna head next, was this idea of the tension between all minority communities, but in this discussion, Native folks, that there's a tension of disclusion, systematic oppression that's come from higher education, that's come from privilege. You know, I sit in a contentious point of being access that knowledge and how to use it in a constructive way and an empowering way. So just to, I guess, acknowledge that the system we're in and trying to work with is the system that oppresses, and having that, just that understanding into how you approach then other people. And we were talking about too, that the work here is long-winded. It's not a quick thing. Many of us have acknowledged this. It's not fast. It is going to be an endeavor, and it takes work. And it's just something that we're really encouraging everyone that's here, that we're excited, like means like, okay, there's like 1,700 next steps. And so we're just hoping that this discussion like sparks something in each person and creates more ideas. And hopefully, should Dan want to partake, Dan's going to facilitate more workshops and get more people discussing the bigger things that so many people have brought up that are huge. I'll let Dan say something now.
Can I jump in with a concrete activity that kind of builds off of a lot of what I've been hearing that I didn't have time to share in my group, or nor put on the shared document? And that is a conversation about the use of knowledge, right? Where like how we know that we know things. You know, kind of the epistemologies of knowledge, if you want to use big words, but also some of the conflicts that go on. There's some good readings on this about the misuse and misappropriation of knowledge and symbols, and why that's destructive. You know, and it goes far beyond the use of headdresses at music festivals, right? There has been this ongoing appropriation of knowledge for financial gain by capitalism. You know, what the example that comes to mind is this idea that we should preserve the Amazon, which I'm totally for preserving the Amazon, because we can find medicines, right? And so then big pharma will appropriate this knowledge and misuse it. And as a consequence, there's the expansion of settler colonial violence in areas that have been, you know, in these areas. And so I really like a conversation about what is knowledge, who gets to own it, who gets to use it, where does it come from, how we see things in different ways, right? And this can introduce very basic ideas of ownership of land, which has come up a few times, versus relationships with land. And bring in a relational knowledge base, of relational approaches to knowledge bases. But also in the classroom, it's a way of prefacing it with the kind of, what are we doing here in the first place? How does this impact the university? What role does the university and the way that we think we know things, what parts does it play in our society? I know that Becky Boger and I have had conversations about the way that maps are used to lie, right? Or promote particular points of view. And you know, the way data is used to do this, the way you know, all of any scheme by which we know things is subject to abuse. And I think students, when you open that up to them and they're like, oh, wait, maybe I should think about this in other ways, it opens up a new realm of critical thinking that I really enjoy. And I'm gonna stop talking now. But I have one more thing before we go. I definitely want this sort of workshop to go ahead. Our plan has always been to set this as kind of a foundational element for something that goes beyond. But I also want to very earnestly, but very seriously, ask for others to jump in and pick up some of the work. And so I hope that as we go forward with the working groups, with the people who've registered, we might send an email out. Maddie, that's possible, right? Sending an email out to the people. We may solicit ideas for future workshops, but also people who are willing to step up a little bit, and assuming that your workload allows, take some of the pressure off of me. All right, thank you. So do we have, I mean, we have a few more minutes left. Does anyone want to offer any final thoughts or kind of closing words?
I don't have final thoughts or closing words. I have two, like a couple things, just concrete before the final thoughts and closing words that you all can do. One is, yeah, so there's a lot of work happening on campus, and this is really, and there's been an amazing session. Thank you so much, Jason and Kaylee and Dan, and we want to make sure we continue the work. This has been conceived of one way. This session was conceived of as part of the anti-racist pedagogy working group that has also been ongoing. And then maybe this would also be, there could be, I think there is some need to kind of think about a frame through into which all this work fits and moves forward. And there's so many possibilities. And so no question, I think, and we can figure out how the CTL can support whatever you might want to do, Dan. But just to say, we have one struggle in this remote world we all live in is how and where to engage in the in-between times. And there are different platforms. There's, ARC exists as active in Slack, and there is also these communities of practice in Teams. Both are really can be very useful spaces and are excellent places to archive ideas and exchange ideas. Just encourage people to try to jump in, even though we have platform fatigue and everything. It's just wonderful to be able to connect with each other. And then we'll absolutely send out everything. Donna and I both have been taking, we just were texting with each other a ton of notes, and we'll run those by the facilitators, but then we'll share out all the resources that people shared. But look how awesome we are. This chat was so rich with resources. And so we'll definitely share those, but hopefully there can be other forms of exchange. And just to flag that we are having this January 14th discussion around grading, critical thoughts and ideas around grading, as well as other events happening that week. So check that out.
I don't want the final word, but I do want to thank you all so very much for your contributions today. I love it that it was lively, that there was distinctions in perspective, and that folks quickly grasped onto the importance of doing the concrete work in the classroom, but knowing that has to be part of a larger cultural context and institutional shift. So I'm grateful to have been a part of it and to, again, be an excuse to bring you all together.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Especially coming out of the first semester of law, I needed something that reminds me why I love doing this stuff and not just be submerged in the doctrines of old rooted law. But this made my heart very happy, and you all were fantastic. I have to thank Dan and Jason for being amazing colleagues. And that I think it's fantastic to be coast to coast sharing knowledge in my sweatpants and my office chair. So I love this. Dan, I'm going to let you finalize us. Thank you all.
Yeah, I just wanted to, again, repeat the chorus of thanks. Thank our facilitators. Thank all of you for contributing. Like, I've been trying to keep up with the chat. To the extent that I failed, I apologize, because it's just been like nonstop, right? It's been trying to watch like the comments to a music video on old MTV or something where they're just like flying by. But much more useful and intelligent than those. But also I want to, I really hope that everyone will keep an eye out for an email about future things. This workshop, I think we covered a lot, but there's still so much more to cover. There's still so many ideas. There's still so many ways that we can get better and get better collectively. So please keep an eye out for that email. And thank you all for coming. And yeah, awesome. I hope to see everyone again. Oh yeah, and by the way, Joseph Enton just popped his email into the chat. That's how I got involved with this, was in one of the ARC meetings. I'm seeing a similar note from Joseph like that. So please avail yourself of that opportunity if you're interested in this stuff. Yeah, and enjoy the snow. Go sledding. Have fun. Don't lick
Thanks,
light
everybody.
boats.